wise man once said, "Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm." And if one thing can be said about Chains of Promathia, it was that it had failed immensely, the likes of which Final Fantasy XI had not seen till that point, and the likes of which 11 might not have seen since. Now it might surprise you that a video essay covering possibly the best and most beloved Final Fantasy XI expansion to have ever existed starts out this way. But Final Fantasy XI Chains of Promathia has quite the story to tell. No, not the story found in the expansion's missions or any of the quest lines. It has a story to tell of how Final Fantasy XI succeeded against all the odds. How even when everything was seemingly stacked against this game, it still succeeded. You see, this story of Chains of Promathia has somewhat been lost to time. But the story is one that sheds light on Final Fantasy XI in 2004, and it sheds light on the game today, and it is most certainly a story worth telling. But if we're going to tell the story properly, we'll have to go back to the beginning. On January 29th of 2000, Square hosted their Millennium event, where they announced 3 new mainline Final Fantasy games. The first was Final Fantasy IX, which was to be released on the PlayStation 1. Final Fantasy X was slated for the brand new PlayStation 2, which in turn was supposed to come out 2 months later, in Japan, and half a year later everywhere else. The last Final Fantasy game announced was Final Fantasy XI, and it was also supposed to come out on the PlayStation 2. The news that Final Fantasy XI was being developed as an MMORPG was met with plenty of controversy, both at the time and still to this day among many Final Fantasy fans. But the dissenters at the time had no cause for concern. You see, internally, Final Fantasy XI's service was only supposed to last as long as the life cycle of the PlayStation 2, which meant that Square Enix had no plans to support the game beyond around 2005 to 2007. Meanwhile, the game comes out and is met with commercial success. A follow-up expansion was soon released, and the number of accounts for Final Fantasy XI rose past 500,000 by April of 2004. Final Fantasy XI was at its peak. It had a wealth of good content, a thriving community, and it multiplied the initial investment poured into the game many times over. What more could be done in Square's first MMO that had not yet been done? 2 weeks after Final Fantasy XI's account number had risen past the 500,000 mark, Square Enix announced a new Final Fantasy XI expansion, Chains of Promathia. This would be a story-focused expansion that would only add new zones, missions, and quests. The fact that this expansion would not include any new jobs or any significant additions to the battle system was met with poor reception, especially among the Japanese player base. The expansion's release did absolutely nothing to help the negative reception either. The expansion was released on September 16th for Japan and September 21st in the West, with the expansion service going live the following day. For many American players, there were many distribution problems with the physical copies, making it difficult to find a copy of the expansion disc. For those who did purchase it, the registration server crashed upon release, making it difficult for many to gain access to the expansion. But when they did, it was full of issues. The PlayStation 2 version of the expansion disc had a horrible bug that had the potential to corrupt all of the game data, forcing some players to reinstall the entire game. There were market bugs that resulted in the inflation and eventual crash of many servers' economies. There were inventory bugs that would allow you to buy multiples of items you could only use one of. The balancing of the expansion was also abysmal on release. The original Promethean zones were designed to give lower-level players as much of a chance of accessing the rest of the expansion content as veteran players. In reality, the missions of these zones were so brutally difficult that few players at all had the chance of clearing them. This was because a significant number of jobs had no comparative advantage whatsoever for these zones. This ultimately meant that the only people who had access to the expansion were those who spent absurd amounts of time jumping through the hoops left behind by Square Enix's balancing team. All of these issues facilitated the sentiment that the lifespan of Final Fantasy XI was coming to an end. The new expansion had plenty of issues, and a significant subset of the player base considered it a failed product on arrival. Not to mention, all of this was taking place during a time another MMO was beginning to generate excitement over its own release. World of Warcraft was so revolutionary for the MMO genre. The genre's history is broken up into two eras, the time before and the time after World of Warcraft. This game would not see the heights it would eventually achieve for another 4 years, but that did not change the fact that its release and rise in popularity gave every other MMO less room to make mistakes, and it came out at exactly the wrong time for Chains of Promathia. All of this resulted in a perfect storm that convinced a vocal minority at the time that Final Fantasy XI had made its fatal mistake. On July 19, 2005, a full 10 months after the expansion's release, Square Enix released the final set of story missions, with perhaps the best expansion ending to this day. It also implemented the C&M system, which was exactly the type of endgame content that many critical players had wanted for the expansion in the first place. The merits of these updates were so well received that over time, the discourse about Final Fantasy XI revolved less around its doomed future and more about the expansion itself. The way Square Enix handled the expansion over these months would wind up changing the legacy that Chains of Promathia would have dramatically. And in hindsight, it isn't difficult to see exactly why. Chains of Promathia today is known for two things. The first is its narrative, and the second was the community it fostered. We'll have to look at both of these before we continue this discussion of the story that this expansion tells outside of the game. The Chains of Promathia story follows the events of Rise of the Zillarts and the fallout from the failed attempt to open the Gate of the Gods. The four nations in the game, being Sandoria, Bastok, Windurst, and Juno, find that the warp crystals at the various crags have been shattered. Their shattering coincides with the Zillart Prince's actions in the previous expansion. Just as a quick side note, 11 tells much of its story in a non-linear episodic fashion. So while the shattering of the crystals is indeed a consequence of the Zillart brothers' actions, no one thing they did is ever said to be the cause of the crystal shattering. All of this is to say that if you're a new player and you want to jump right into Chains of Promathia, you can. You don't have to complete the previous two stories. Anyway, the shattering of the warp crystals at these crags also coincides with the appearance of a really creepy-looking kid who was taken to Juno to have his injuries mended. The adventurer is sent out to investigate the shattering of the warp crystals. Before he begins his investigation, he learns of a mysterious organization that has taken interest in the creepy kid. They also seem to know exactly why the crystals have shattered, but they really do not want you to know why. The adventurer eventually finds that these old crags aren't natural monoliths at all. Rather, they are ancient structures built to encase the mother crystals of Vana'diel. On another side note, if you want any evidence that 11's story is underappreciated, I'll point to the fact that the Final Fantasy Wiki had a page for the Mother Crystals of Final Fantasy XVI before it had a page on the Mother Crystals of Final Fantasy XI. I know this because I recently finished 16 and wanted to compare the lore between the Mother Crystals of both games. Rather than reading an entry on 11's Mother Crystals, I had to write an entry instead. While on his way to the first Mother Crystal he visits, he discovers that it has been surrounded by a Promethean dimension, signifying the weakening of the Mother Crystals. As he travels from crag to crag, he finds himself on the run from the mysterious organization, who chases both him and the mysterious boy to each of the Mother Crystals, before the boy helps the adventurer escape. Eventually, you learn that the Mother Crystals are responsible for fending off the emptiness, a force devouring the land like it did in the Promethean dimensions. This has forced the hand of two groups. The first is the mysterious group of people who are chasing the creepy kid. These people have an interest in protecting the crystals and using them to open the Gate of the Gods, much like the Zillart princes from the previous story. The second group forced into action is comprised of Celtius, the creepy kid running around, and the avatar Bahamut, who claims that if the first group gets its way and opens the Gate of the Gods, this could bring about the apocalypse, and as a consequence he has declared war on the first group and the enlightened races. A group of survivors from the once proud nation of Tavnazia gets caught in this conflict because their leader, Prish, an Elvan woman, has a mysterious connection to the apocalypse that Bahamut is trying to stop. The story from here gets even more complicated, involving other Zilart and Kalu in the Juno government, the Far Eastern country, and their representative Tenzin, a group of Mithrin sin hunters who are duty-bound to hunt the one responsible for this conflict, triplet Tarutaru orphans in search of power and their father, and many others. These groups of people do not fit neatly on either side of the conflict, which gives the story far more nuance than simply being about good versus evil. The cast of characters in this expansion is huge, boasting about 13 to 15 core characters depending on how you count. Chains of Promathia also goes for the ensemble cast approach to its characters, which greatly benefits some more than others. Some of my favorite characters in this cast are Tenzin, the representative from the Far East, whose character arc is by far the most compelling in the expansion. Prish, the Elvan leader of Tavnazia, whose past has left her as a sort of outcast among those she leads, and Celtius, who winds up being the coolest character in the story, and who you find has been working behind the scenes to keep both sides of the conflict from having their way entirely. The expansion does truly have some of the best characters in the game, even if a couple of these characters aren't given the amount of character development as they probably should. Most of the characters of this expansion are given a proper story, with tension and good pacing. This cast also feels distinctly Final Fantasy. The way they interact with each other, the way the cast develops as a whole, and the roles they serve in the story is quite reminiscent of the SNES and PS1 era Final Fantasy games. While certain casts of characters give Chains of Promathia a run for its money, I can't help but feel that this cast might be the best in the game, and certainly stands out among many of the casts in the mainline series. The characters aren't the only area where Chains of Promathia goes big, though. The plot tackles many different subplots, ranging from the conflict between the celestial and terrestrial avatars, the political relations between Sandoria and Tavnazia, the environmental implications of the dying mother crystals, and many more. While many of these subplots aren't given enough screen time to be fully fleshed out, the degree to which they are included is almost always relevant and impactful to the main plot of the expansion. As for the main plot, it does a phenomenal job at tackling abstract themes like determinism, without resorting to cheap writing fallbacks like making Destiny or Fate an actual concrete villain or something. The emptiness that plagues Vana'diel is used as an allegory for the sins that each of the enlightened races are cursed with. The plot then takes the cast of characters and forces them to confront the sins that plague them. It is through this conquering of each character's personal sin which ultimately allows them to save the world. Tenzin, a Hume, never becomes apathetic towards the situation, despite being cursed with the sin of apathy. Prish, an Elvan, is made willing to sacrifice herself, despite the sin of pride that the Elvan are cursed with. None of this thematic execution is ever cheaply written in or disjointed with the rest of the story, which is rare in Final Fantasy games nowadays. This isn't the only example of phenomenal thematic execution, though. In fact, the expansion is full of these examples. Now, if the plot sounds complicated, that's most certainly because it is. There is a lot going on in this expansion's narrative, and despite how great most of it is, I would be lying if I didn't say that it doesn't feel a bit bloated. The story is usually complicated, sometimes convoluted, and in one or two glaring examples, a bit contrived. But the reason this expansion story is remembered so fondly isn't because it tells a good story despite its mistakes, but because it tells a good story despite the game's genre. You see, Chains of Promathia marked the beginning of a shift away from the environmental storytelling that Final Fantasy XI had used up until this point, and towards a more plot-focused narrative. And this was the first time a story of this magnitude was ever told in an MMO. This was a story that could stand among the greats in the single-player RPGs. The effects of Chains of Promathia would continue to shape the rest of 11, and even 14 to a large degree. Modern Final Fantasy XIV took after World of Warcraft in its gameplay design, much like 11 took after EverQuest in its own. But the narrative structure of 14, and preceding 11 expansions, are very much so products of Chains of Promathia. This expansion was the beginning of a wealth of pinnacle Final Fantasy stories appearing in the MMO genre. It always saddens me to see someone claim to have played every game in the main series of Final Fantasy, but go on to learn that they've never touched 11. Some of the best stories in the franchise are told through this game, and players who avoid 11 miss out on those stories, such as Chains of Promathia, Wings of the Goddess, and Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. And many Final Fantasy fans who praise Final Fantasy XIV for its narrative focus don't even realize where that narrative focus comes from. Regardless, Chains of Promathia isn't only a good story, but it's one that raised the bar for Final Fantasy and MMOs forever afterward. While Chains of Promathia was developed primarily as a mission and quest-oriented expansion, that doesn't mean there is no new gameplay content. Along with the additional zones, the most notable gameplay addition in the expansion is Dreamworld Dynamis, Limbus, and a new set of NMs. Before we discuss any of these additions, however, it is important to note that Chains of Promathia iterated on the core gameplay loop of Rise of the Zilart in a way that many of the expansions afterward would follow. Between each mission, Rise of the Zilart would give you a reason to go and explore the zones. From collecting elemental fragments all around the world, to finding and fighting certain monsters, Rise of the Zilart tells a story between bouts of exploration. Chains of Promathia, on the other hand, has a much larger variety of activities for players to do in order to progress the story. Some missions will have you getting through memory receptacle puzzles in the Promethean zones, while others will turn the game into a platformer where you have to make it up a steep mountain. Another has you unlocking gates in search for a monster that has been terrorizing the aqueducts underneath the Tavnazian safehold. While not all of these new methods of interacting with the game world are equally good, I found myself greatly enjoying the variety that it provides, making the expansion feel far more dynamic and involved than its predecessor. Chains of Promathia's zone design feels quite distinct from that of the previous expansion. I would argue that very few of these new zones ever feel quite as intricate as the Rise of the Zilart zones. While playing through the game, I purposefully avoided all new zones until I got to that zone's expansion. While I don't have any evidence for what I'm about to say, exploring the zones in release order like this gave me the impression that Rise of the Zilart zones were designed around the quests and activities the developers wanted to include, whereas Chains of Promathia zones feel far more like they were developed with the intent of housing the missions they were developed for instead. In the end, I found the zone design in Rise of the Zilart to be far more enjoyable to explore and offer more rewards for exploration, whereas exploration in Chains of Promathia has far more spectacle that greatly complements the story set pieces. A good example of this is when the adventurer visits each of the mother crystals at the beginning of the expansion. Crawling through the Promethean zones, these dark and horrid locations, while trying to figure out the memory receptacle puzzles to advance the zones and get to the mother crystals is a very memorable moment in the expansion. But after getting to the third mother crystal and being warped out to hear the Lufay's meadow music and see the green grass and bright sky rather than the never-ending darkness is just one example of how Chains of Promathia facilitates this feeling of spectacle. I can't say which approach I prefer between these two expansions, but I will say that very few things in Rise of the Zilart was as memorable as hearing the Lufay's meadow music for the first time. Dreamworld Dynamis is an extension to the regular Dynamis that Rise of the Zilart added. In Dreamworld Dynamis, there are 3 new zones that you can battle through for a 4th unlockable zone, a bit like the unlockable zones in the previous iteration of Dynamis. To unlock that zone, you need to find, spawn, and defeat 3 notorious monsters, one in each of the starting zones. Each of them drop a key item that will eventually allow you to unlock the 4th zone, which gives a wider variety of drops and items. As for the relic gear that's awarded in these zones, all 4 zones are needed to farm a full set, so if you're going to do repeated runs of Dynamis for certain gear, unlocking this 4th zone is necessary. Some of these notorious monsters that you have to fight still put up a bit of a challenge today for new players if you don't know how the mechanics of the fight work. Needless to say, I really enjoyed playing through this content, and it offers incredible gear for both sandbagging players who play at under max level, and players who want to start working on a modern fully upgraded set of relic gear. Another form of gameplay content added in this expansion is Limbus. Limbus rewards the player with special types of gear, the ability to upgrade Artifact Armor, which is one of the ultimate armor sets in the game, and finally certain accessories, some of which are still considered best in slot for certain use cases in the game. The way the content works is the player goes through one of 3 zones in the Lemuria region. The first 2 zones are called Apollyon, which is the Promethean region of Altair, and it is broken into the East and West Apollyon. The third and final zone is an edifice called Tenemus, which is a building of Altair. There are particular points in these zones where, to continue progressing, you must fight certain bosses and use their drops to gain further access. These bosses also drop plenty of rewards in their own right, so they are part of the content rather than simply being roadblocks to the content. If you're playing through Final Fantasy XI's content in order of release, this will be the first dedicated battle content that you must do with other people, as you cannot summon trusts to form NPC parties in Limbus. While I didn't spend too much time playing through Limbus, I found it to be a bit more engaging than either versions of Dynamis, mostly due to the system of chests that players will find while playing. There are 4 types of chests that spawn. The blue chest, which lengthens the initial 30-minute time limit when you enter Limbus. The brown chest restores your HP and MP, and also resets the cooldowns of all of your abilities, including your 2-hour abilities. The brown and gold chest is a loot chest that gives you certain aforementioned rewards. The last chest that you'll find is actually a false chest that turns into a monster once interacted with. The 4 chests add a level of agency and urgency to the content for me, and being able to use my 2-hour abilities multiple times in the span of a couple minutes feels absolutely insane, and progressing this content feels unlike any other battle content in the game up until this point. There is one incredible moment in Chains of Promathia, one moment most players who've beat the expansion will never forget. That is the first time you step foot in Altair. While the ultimate zone of the last expansion, Ruin Garden, was incredible, the zone design and systems of Altair, or C, takes the spectacle that the zones of Chains of Promathia are so good at up to a whole new level. To accompany this jaw-dropping zone is the most infamous piece of battle content in the game, the C NM system. The NM system had a far heavier roster than the Sky NM system did, and the method of spawning many of the NMs weren't discovered for months after the content's release. Today, this NM system offers a wonderful excuse to explore the beautiful zones of Altair, and it drops phenomenal sandbagging gear if you can deal with the challenge. The primary reason that the CNM system is so infamous is because it is the system that gave us Absolute Virtue. For those who aren't aware, Absolute Virtue is a high notorious monster that was so difficult it was never really beaten through legitimate means until years of power creep allowed players far more powerful than intended for the fight to best it. While the history of Absolute Virtue is a little too extensive for the scope of this video, suffice it to say, for modern players, Absolute Virtue is one of the most enjoyable NMs to fight in the entire game. The soundtrack of this expansion is one that confused me a bit. One thing that made Rise of the Zillart's soundtrack, and Treasures of Ottergon's soundtrack for that matter, so great, was their ability to have complex, intricate melodies without sacrificing how well the music complements their intended use case. Naoshi Mizuta has a phenomenal gift of combining the 2 elements of ambience and melody. However, for many tracks in Chains of Promathia, he opted for a less focused approach to melody. While all of the tracks are still used to great effect, the simplified melodies throughout the soundtrack aren't as effective in my opinion as the more intricate melodies from his other works. This doesn't apply to all of the pieces in the soundtrack though. Several of these pieces are truly beautiful in their own right. There is one piece, and several of its arrangements in the soundtrack that were used in a really special way. The Memoria della Stona is, in my opinion, one of the best pieces of music in the Final Fantasy series. The expansion includes 6 different arrangements of this piece, and there is even an in-story reason why this piece has different arrangements. Hearing this piece build from the simple melody and accompaniment that plays in the beginning, through the arrangements, to finally hearing what it sounds like in the ending of the expansion, is one of the best musical experiences I've had in a Final Fantasy game. Hearing the final arrangement of that song plays no small part in shaping my opinion that Chains of Promathia has one of the best endings to a Final Fantasy story in the series. This ending and its music was one of the things that many fans cited when asked about their positive impression of the expansion once it wrapped up, so I'm not the only one who found it greatly impactful. And there it is, Chains of Promathia, one of the best Final Fantasy XI expansions of all time, with a story and ensemble cast of characters to rival any other Final Fantasy story, engaging combat content, and breathtaking music. Chains of Promathia, in my mind, is when Final Fantasy XI goes from being a great game to a masterpiece. This expansion forever solidified Final Fantasy XI's position among the best in the Final Fantasy series. Oh yeah, we still have that to talk about. Chains of Promathia released in one of the most uncertain times in Final Fantasy XI's history. Initially, its reception among a significant subset of players wasn't all that positive, but it was thanks to the game's phenomenal story and its gameplay systems, which fostered a strong sense of community that allowed it to exceed when everything seemed to be stacked against it. The expansion still holds up as a great narrative, and many new players still get to experience some of it for the first time. It revolutionized storytelling in the MMO genre, and both 11 and 14 have garnered an untold amount of loyalty, thanks to the innovations that this expansion makes. But as easily as Chains of Promathia became a classic forever revered among fans, it could have just as easily failed and doomed 11 to obscurity. Chains of Promathia tells the story of Final Fantasy XI in the early 2000s. It tells of a game that was doomed to fail. It tells of a game that did fail over and over. And most importantly, it tells of the game that succeeded and now means so much to so many. But just as Chains of Promathia tells the story of Final Fantasy XI 20 years ago, it also tells the story of Final Fantasy XI today. 11 has been abandoned by most of its developers, and its budget has been cut to a fraction of what it once was. Square Enix has tried to end the story content for this game. They've implemented stories that funnel players into their newer MMO, and they've even tried to replace it. Final Fantasy XI today is a game with everything stacked against it. It's a game doomed to fail. It's a game that has failed over and over. But most importantly, after 20 years, it still has tens of thousands of faithful players who log in every day, whether that be on retail or private servers. Despite all of its shortcomings, this awkward, janky, and dated game still continues to captivate myself and thousands of others thanks to its unforgettable story, phenomenal music, immersive world, and engaging gameplay. Chains of Promathia tells the story of Final Fantasy XI and its success. And many years from now, when the last server for 11 is shut down, it will do so while thousands of loyal players bid it a heartfelt farewell. There are a couple people I'd like to thank who've helped make my videos what they are. The first is Wild Dragon Chase, also known as Reddit user RCL. He's the one who's made all of the NM charts that I've been using, and his input on both Rise of the Zilart and Chains of Promathia have really shifted my perspective on multiple things. The second person I'd like to thank is Reddit user Ikari Luna, whose input on this video essay prompted me to do several rewrites of the story section. Finally, there is Space Roast, who has provided all of these Final Fantasy XI remixes. I listen to these all the time, and I sincerely hope you do too. His work is really second to none. And finally, thank you, dear viewer, for sticking it out till the end of the video. I do hope you enjoyed.